Hello and welcome. My name is Eric Farewell and welcome to another episode of Refining Your Paramotor Skills. AJ Goins is going to be coming up on the screen in just a moment, sharing a lot of his favorite techniques for things you can do to increase your safety, your skill, and make the sport look easy as can be. Hope you enjoy the video. Take care.
Hello aviators, I'm AJ Goin and I'm the lead instructor at Aviator Paramotor. This is going to be another video here at the Red Barn. This time is going to be covering foot dragging and the best way to do this. So before every flight, I typically inspect my motor in great detail, my motor and my wing. And while I'm doing that, I typically also think about the objectives that I'm trying to set out to complete for that day of flying. And it's a good time for me not only to think about how much time I want to dedicate to specific maneuvers, but also to think, am I in the right mindset? Am I in the right mind space? Am I clear-headed? Am I ready to take on the next challenge that I'm about to take? And I want you guys to be honest with yourselves, and every single time you fly, to do this exact same thing. Think, are you ready to go out and do what you're about to do? Are you not only mentally prepared, but are you at a skill level where you can do this shit? You really want to be honest with yourself and not try and jump steps, because that's going to ultimately get you into more trouble and you're not going to learn the correct way. So make sure that we've mastered all these previous steps before we move on to the next step. A very important thing to take in consideration when you're starting to learn these foot drags is going to be location. Obviously you're going to want to find somewhere that's very open, very smooth, preferably some manicured grass would be great. No obstructions like power lines, fences, trees, or any other kind of obstacles that could obviously create rotor or hazards to fly into. The easiest conditions to foot drag in are going to be zero wind, nice and smooth and calm air. But for learning, you're going to have a little more room for error if you fly in some higher winds. That being said, it needs to be a very smooth laminar air. It can't be gusty or bumpy. It's going to be very confusing and very hard to learn whenever it's gusty or bumpy, or turbulent rather. So the best conditions, if you can't get smooth high wind, like when I say high wind, I'm talking 4 to 10 mile per hour wind. If you can get in that range with nice smooth laminar air, I would recommend that and flying into the wind. But if you can't get that, then dead calm is going to be the best. The only problem with zero wind is going to be that if you make a mistake and you end up having to running out, obviously you're going to have to run a lot faster. One of the safer ways to learn this is to start out by going up to say 50 or 30 feet. That's going to be a good altitude for you to find a good reference point on the ground, a straight line to follow. You're going to want to try and maintain that straight line as far as you can. What ends up happening is that most people end up building up oscillations trying to fly in that straight line. So what you want to do is think of this more of following or getting on the heading of the line that you're trying to follow and then maintaining oscillation control. If you think of it that way, you won't build up oscillations and you'll end up inherently following that straight line. But if you try and minimize, or if you try and stay exactly above that straight line the whole time, you're going to eventually basically build up oscillations, and that's what happens more times than not. So once you've got this skill dialed in where you're maintaining a straight line for hundreds of yards, and not building oscillations and staying directly above that object or that line, then you're ready to bring it down a little bit lower. And just keep doing that over and over until you've really got this dialed in. This is not only going to teach you roll oscillation, help you get that skill dialed in, but it's also going to help you manage your energy and understand that energy management, because you're going to be a little bit closer to the ground, and inherently by pulling those brakes, it's going to cause that wing to fall back and surge forward and fall back and surge forward. So you'll have a little bit more room for error being above the ground, getting yourself into roll and pitch oscillations, and then that's going to teach you how to stop those without having to think about that, basically. At this point in the game, controlling roll oscillations should be intuitive. You should already know what to do without having to stop and think about it. You shouldn't be looking at your wing trying to time when to stop those things. It should be automatic. If at any point during any of these exercises, whether it be at 50 feet, 30 feet, or even foot dragging, you find yourself getting into an oscillation, let's go ahead and add power, add a little bit of brakes, and get out of the situation and start all the way over. Oscillations can build to the point where it becomes dangerous, whether it be roll oscillation or pitch oscillation. So as soon as you start to get off into a swing of any sort, let's just add power, go up, go around, and do it again. Always err on the side of safety. As paramotor pilots, for some reason, water is our magnet. It's our kryptonite. And obviously one of the leading causes in paramotoring is drowning. So let's make sure we stay away from water until we really get foot dragging dialed in. Water is way more deceptive than you would imagine. Very smooth, calm water is very fun to foot drag, but it also acts like a vacuum on some shoes. This is not something that you want to go out and try and foot drag deep water. And also, you should always have power floats installed on your paramotor, regardless if you plan on flying above water, because inherently we find ourselves above water all the time. So make sure that let's leave the water alone for quite a while, and you should imagine that you should be able to foot drag for a very long period of time without lifting up or coming down surprisingly, probably hundreds if not thousands of times before you start to try and do water. And if you try and transition to water, it should be puddles. It should be very short, shallow puddles that you can still run out in case you were to make a mistake. But just keep in mind that smooth water is very hard to tell where you're at in relation to it. Once you touch down and you feel the water, then you kind of got a little bit of a feeler gauge. But I'm saying this because it's very easy to misjudge where you're at in relation to the water, hit the water, and then your prop or your motor dies because of that, and now there's no way to exit and you're in the water. So let's leave the water alone for quite a while. So now that we've got all these other things covered, let's talk about getting into foot dragging and the best way to do this. So we've done some low passes and we've maintained a straight and level flight without getting ourselves into pitch or roll oscillations. We're ready to move it down a little bit. So as we go down, one of the things that I like to teach people how to do is first, let's add some brakes nice and slow down to our ear level. And again, this is going to be relative to what wing you're flying and where your brake positions are at. But you basically want about 3 pounds of pressure on those brakes. You're pulling a little bit of energy out of the wing, but what we're going to be able to do is find a nice cruise setting with our throttle, with our brakes at our ear level. If we're maintaining straight and level flight with that cruise setting and our brakes at our ear level, then we have a little bit of room for error here. So what we can do is you can do this at about 30 feet, get really comfortable with your brakes at your ear level with a cruise power setting. And if you want to come down, you're going to go hands back up, keeping that throttle setting without ever changing it. And what's happening here is you're going to allow your wing to fly at a faster airspeed, so you're going to start to descend just slightly. And as you descend and you start to level off and get where you want, you're going to pull those brakes back down to your ears, level back off, and now you've got the altitude that you want. But let's say all of a sudden you need to go back up because maybe the terrain is changing or you hit a gust of wind. Now you can start to pull those brakes back down a little bit further. So the ear level is going to be about that sweet spot, or 3 pounds of pressure is going to be that sweet spot where you can still pull more brake and be safe, or you can let a little bit of brake up to come back down. That's a good setting to have for foot dragging. Obviously, there is a point of no return. Once you start to get into your shoulder level height with your brakes, you're going to need to add more power, obviously. You should have already probably been adding power if you started adding those brakes. But once your brakes start to go past those shoulders, you should go ahead and probably abandon the foot drag and start all the way over, because you're at that point of where you've got no more room for air with your brake pull. You're essentially at the verge of a stall. So you want to go ahead and smoothly ramp into full power and then slowly go hands up as you climb out. If you get to the point where your hands are going below your shoulders and into your nipples, obviously you're at more risk for a stall, so you may end up having to actually run that landing out by keeping those brakes and slowly reducing the power and just turning that foot drag into a landing. So we've talked about the best way to enter this is to start at 50 feet, work your way down to about 30 feet, and then start at that point flying actively with those brakes at your ears, or 3 pounds of pressure relative to whatever your wing brake position may be. Once you've really got that dialed down and you're not making mistakes and you're using your brakes in succession to stop, roll, and pitch oscillations, but also maintain a nice straight and level flight, using in sequence with your power, now you can bring it down to the ground. So at some point, it's actually going to be harder to try and do this at, like, say 5 or 10 feet than it is to actually foot drag. The reason why is because once you get to the point where you're actually foot dragging, now you have a feeler gauge. You have an extra response built into your body telling you, oh, I'm coming down. I need to add more brakes, or I need to add more power. Whatever the case may be, you have that extra sensory input. And so sometimes it's actually easier once you get down to that 15-foot range to just go ahead and start trying to foot drag. You shouldn't expect to just get it right off the bat. This is going to take a long time, and you're going to have to run some of these foot drags out into landings, basically. Your foot drag is going to be modified into a landing, so just expect that. So let's say we finally got ourselves to the position where we're ready to touch down and do some foot drags. As we come down, we want to make sure that we keep 1 foot forward and 1 foot back. Myself personally, I like to drag my right foot back, but I'm at the point where I can do both simultaneously, left or right. And sometimes I'll drag both of my feet back for fun. Just know that when people drag both their feet, it's a very big commitment level on their part. They're not going to have any opportunity to run out any mistakes that they have. This is not something that I recommend anyone doing. It's more of a goon maneuver, so just keep that in mind. But for learning this, you're always going to have 1 foot forward and 1 foot back, using that back foot to drag and kind of use it as a feeler gauge to know whether you're descending or ascending. Pulling brakes down is going to be instant lift. It's going to respond immediately, but it's going to be momentary. So what we need to do is slowly ramp into that power. If this is going to be a sustained thing that we need, if we need that constant lift, so we'll use that brake to get off, or to get up rather, but then we're going to add a little bit of power, but nice and slow. Our throttle management should be very smooth and slow and deliberate. The other thing to consider is that any throttle increases are going to take about 3 to 5 seconds for that wing to level off and respond accordingly. So if you add power even a little bit, what ends up happening is you end up pushing yourself out from underneath the wing, so therefore the angle of attack increases and you start to lift, but it's still going to be momentary. So you may have found the perfect throttle setting, but it's going to take about 3 to 5 seconds to know that, because the wing is going to fall back, you're going to lift, and then the wing's going to level off. That's when you know, after about 3 or 5 or maybe even 7 seconds, whether or not your throttle setting was either too little or too much. But what ends up oftentimes happening is people end up having too much power, and then they let off, and then they add too much, and then they let off, and they get into these pitch oscillations. You add brakes to that whole scenario, and now you're getting into a weird bunkin' bronco scenario here. So if at any point you find yourself in that oscillation, remember, let's just add power, climb up, go around and do it again. Power is a better way to manage this energy and to maintain this straight and level flight. If at any point I'm out foot dragging and my hands start to go below my ears for longer than a second or two, I end up adding a little bit more power so that I can get my hands back up. I like to leave as much energy in that wing as I possibly can by keeping my hands as high as I possibly can. The more brakes that you use, the less room for air you have. And it's very common to try and foot drag and get task saturated and end up stalling the wing and turning that into a landing. So just remember, be prepared to turn any kind of foot drag into a landing that you may end up unexpectedly having to run this out. But eventually you're going to get really good at foot dragging, and you're going to be able to do this without having to think about it. And you can also turn these into landings, basically. So you can use this to come in an area that maybe has a lot of rotor or some other area that's not safe to fly into. You can ease your way into that area by foot dragging into it and then landing accordingly. And the best way to do that is to essentially start to roll off your power and slowly flare at the exact same time. You can do that, or you could even, just dump power and pull a bunch of brakes and balloon up a little bit. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but eventually you'll get there. And just know that practice makes perfect, and you always want to fly into the wind and stay safe. I was trying to catch the. Sorry. I was trying to catch the stupid camera. I was doing it before you ever even got here.